Welcome back. Now, the Paris Climate Finance Summit hosted by President Emmanuel Macron sat last week. Speaking at that summit, President Cyril Ramaphosa said the shift to renewable energy must be equitable and just, and in fact urged for commitment and partnership for its completion. Kenyan President William Ruto urged world leaders to speed up climate action through financial reform and asked for more clarity on how the $9 trillion needed annually to stop global warming will reach African countries. Let's unpack these developments now with Thomas Lesaffre, who is a researcher with the Environment Shield, joining us via our video link this morning. Thomas, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time for us here on Newzroom Afrika. You know, that summit was attended, we understand, by several leaders from the Global South who also put forward some of their own concerns, largely through the Bridgetown initiative. I wonder whether you reckon enough time was spent in the summit unpacking just the complexity of the issues they raised.
Yeah, the complexity of the topic is really huge. What we need to imagine is that the question that is asked in those summits is, how does the Global South adapt to climate change if it's already in debt of the previous period, right? So you can think of a country like Zambia that have defaulted in the reimbursement of its debt in 2020. When we ask Zambia to build a new dam or to build like more sustainable like coal stations, we need to also remember that they have to reimburse the debt that they have contracted prior to it. So many African presidents came to the summit and remind the audience that it is important that we have a climate justice, a fair and just transitions, and that we need to pause the reimbursement of certain debt. Certain debt that have to be reimbursed are not as important as the investment that need to be made for climate change. So it's very important that the continent came together here and explain what's the situation of the Global South, which is suffering the most from climate change when he's not the one responsible, mainly responsible for it. But yet, he has to adapt and money needs to come from somewhere. So many leaders call for a reorganization of financial structure, and President Ruto from Kenya, for instance, had a big euro bond to be paid by June next year, asked for also a delay of that debt to be paid. So if the debt of the 2010 can be paid in the 2030, we would have more chance for those countries to adapt to climate change and to have to make the choice between poverty and investing against poverty and investing against climate change.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've heard some commentators, and I think our own President Cyril Ramaphosa was quoted as saying perhaps there was a bit of naivety in accepting some of the terms of these conditions around, you know, this just energy transition, especially when you reckon the starting point for many countries in the Global South and the work they need to put in order to ensure that those agreements are in fact realized. Do you reckon there's credence to that?
So that's what Ramaphosa called on, and he's right. He reminded everyone, for instance, that if the project of a massive dam on the Congo River, Inga 3, we've been talking about it and we're looking for finance for this project since the 90s. He says that if the finance was made in the 2010, we would already have that dam, right? And so he said we can go to a lot of summits like this and speak of the reorganization of the architecture of finance, but at the end of the day, it is really important that it's not in the hand of those countries to actually sign the check, right? It's inside organizations such as IMF, African Bank of Development, World Bank organizations, and all of those organizations have been talking, but sometimes not all the money has been coming. So for instance, I want to give you a number. There's $200 billion that are supposed to be sent just this year, and right now it's $115 billion. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that the money is not always paid, and it's important that we ask for the money to be paid. But in also retrospect, President Ruto said it clearly. It's not just about the money being paid so the country can develop a climate resilience agenda. It is about the debt to be paid, not as beggars, because it has to be paid, but also for money to be used in the right directions, right? Kenyans have no interest in repaying the debt if they fall into poverty or if climate deregulates their society to such an extent that the state will be unfunctional. One of the problems also of those conferences is that they keep offering a new idea, but those are conferences that build up for the COP, right? So that was also a conference to build up for COP 25 in Dubai, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Dubai. And so it's also important to realize that we prepare for a COP where there will be more announcements made, but money needs to be sent. So sometimes money is sent, sometimes money is not sent, and it's important the Global South claim is part. Yeah.
Yeah. Given what you've just said, where do you reckon that puts the value of such summits? I mean, the sense I'm getting from you is that in many instances, it's just talks about talks and, you know, the kind of agreements that are reached there are not really realized, if you're still with us, Thomas. All right, looks like we've lost our connection there to Thomas Lesaffre, who's live to us there from Uganda, as we try and pack the usefulness, or perhaps the lack thereof, of the Paris Climate Finance Summit. It sat last week, hosted, of course, in part by President Emmanuel Macron. Thomas, I'm told that you're back on the line with us. I'm not sure if you caught that question. I was trying to ascertain for you whether you reckon these summits are even useful then.
So what is useful right now, and thank you for taking me back, because it's very important. We're looking at the president, right? The presidents are talking to each other. It's great. They travel by big plane that make a lot of carbon emissions. They talk, they try to find solutions. It's important. We cannot organize climate strength or climate resilience with the current infrastructure, the financial infrastructure, right? So the IMF needs to fall. The Bretton Woods Agreement, made after the Second World War, is the one ruling the world right now when it comes to finance. So it's really important we look at a president, we look at financial architecture, and we make sure that the money that comes to the continent to finance climate change come at a certain price. It has to be cheaper than it is right now, because there's a lot of interest there, right? However, what is really important also is to remember that there's a lot of activists in parallel, right, that are in Africa right now and that have been to Paris. I'm thinking of Vanessa Nakate, I'm thinking of Patience, Global. All those activists also say a lot about how their society should be reorganized toward climate resilience, right? So we need to remember, we need to listen both sides. It's important we both look at what finance can do, but also when the money is coming to our country, to Kenya, to South Africa, what is happening, right? ESCOM is coming with saving European Union money. We need to also have activists to make sure that ESCOM is doing the right things on the ground, right? So we need to look at both sides. We need to look at the leadership and new architecture, but also at what is the leadership doing while we save the money within the country. And we have the chance in this continent to have a really passionate, like, young activist generations. And I'm really confident they will do better job probably than the president in Paris.
That's really the question I was hoping to ask you next. You know, when it comes to that second discussion that you reckon should be having, this intra-Africa discussion about once the money arrives in different countries on the continent, how confident are we that it'll, you know, essentially be used for its intended purposes? You know, and that opens us up to a whole different discussion around governance, corruption potentially, and whether or not, you know, activists that you've just mentioned can really rely on the support they need from government.
Listen, it's complicated. The government is learning as it's doing. A lot of people, that generation in governance today is not fully aware of how, no generation in power is aware of how do we transform our society to make them climate resilient as we speak. But it is important we look at it. Think about, for example, ESCOM, right? ESCOM uses a lot of coal. We know we need to transfer it to a more green energy, more renewable energy. Now, ESCOM is a South African entity, so only South African can have a look at it. Now, imagine if there is a way to finance a dam, let's say in Congo, that will provide electricity to South Africa, which is totally possible, and to 14 other countries in the region. Then if the countries sit together to look at how the money is used, how the money is dispatched, I believe we have a better chance into making sure that this money is used for the right reason, right? So we need definitely some reform of governance, but a reform of governance that I think lead towards Pan-Africanism, because the problem with fronting is Pan-African. The climate is changing is in the same way in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, or in Botswana, right? So if we could find a solution on which finance can be hosted by not just one, but 2 or 3 different countries, on which we will find some sort of like balances, that would be great. But I'm also aware of the difficulty that could bring, especially when political parties are friends with each other, right? Yeah. But I think it's one of the solutions, definitely.
Absolutely. You know, my real concern, Thomas, is most of the times these conversations really feel highbrow. They take place in these echo chambers among people who are perhaps activists, researchers who spend their lives dedicating themselves to this kind of work. And the difficulty is that we leave behind the people who are most affected by this at grassroots levels. I wonder whether or not you reckon we've cracked that challenge yet. You know, how do we distill these conversations so that at the very least we don't leave behind the very people the conversations are about?
So it's a big question you're asking me here. I feel like we are in a point where we need to educate the people. So what you're doing, trying to speak of those topics, even if they're complex, at a time where a large amount of people watch the show, it's important. It's part of education. But we need also to ask ourselves the right question, right? What is the economic system that have led us where we are? What is the planet trying to say, and what living condition are we going to give to our kids, right? And so I think when we go, like, the more concrete we go, the more we realize that it's very complicated. I'm thinking in Uganda, for instance, a lot of infrastructure, the country is not as rich as South Africa. A lot of infrastructure have been made in the 2000s. They already have been destroyed by some phenomenon linked to climate change. So it is very important we don't wait for the wars to come, and we start this conversation right now. And you're right, it's not just about researchers or activists. It's about farmers. Farmers are really key, really important. Farmers are going to suffer a lot. So it's about food security for us. It's about the weather and that we want to give to our kids, right? So definitely, I think there's away from this global conversation. And now we have a place at this global conversation, and it's really important we listen to the activists that have already experienced climate change. What solution do they bring? What solution do they think of? The grounded one. And maybe that will speak to the people a bit more than those big conversations in Doha, Glasgow, or those big summits.
Absolutely. There's plenty to think about, and hopefully we get this right given what's at stake. Thomas Lesaffre, thanks very much indeed for weighing in.